You don't need to consult the dusty scholarship of Grey Witch to learn of those who dwell within Devil's Clay. You might need only walk the lonely roads that wind aimlessly about the Low House Woods, or linger past nightfall at the foot of Gallows Hill. They are like shadows cast in flesh, and wander like old memories waiting to be remembered. You may find these strange creatures dressed in dark gowns, playing marbles with quiet children you have never seen before, on a street you never knew existed, and all this in the small town you have known your entire life. They may even stand in your vegetable garden at midnight, staring up at the stars while blowing into a flute. Yet, when you rush out to meet them, they are gone, and only animal tracks mark the spot where they stood. However, these facts are only dimly reflected in the mind of the common Grey Witcher, who tend to dress strangeness in the garments of myth and strenuous imagination, a habit many of us affect from necessity rather than stubbornness. Nonetheless, we are all aware, to different degrees, of a particularly horrible tale, preserved by nightmare, if not memory, that has sufficiently conquered any curiosity or courage any Grey Witcher might wish to exercise, which, I suspect, was most likely the desired effect. For many weeks prior to this blasphemous event, there occurred an unusually high number of stories concerning strange persons walking down the road to Devil's Clay. Person-like things that casted oblivion-black shadows, and whose gloomy silhouettes seemed nearly luminous against the inferior darkness of the night they traveled by. Other reports were wild with visions of long, spindly-limbed shapes that swam through gray oceans of growling thunderstorm, storms that chased, against the wind, that one nameless road that slithers into Devil's Clay. One of the stranger tales concerning these dark pilgrims was supplied by the ancestor of a bygone apple farmer, Mrs. Lim, a distant, faint biological echo of a one Margaret Pinefax, once shared with me the more exotic version of the common nightmare dreamt of by the garden variety Grey Witcher. According to her more intricate story, passed down through a more concentrated channel of ancestral nightmare, Margaret Pinefax lived near that nameless length of denuded earth that conducted, like some hideous artery, those strange persons who were sometimes glimpsed traveling to Devil's Clay. While crouched within her neighbor's orchard well after sundown, the best time to poison your rival's trees, she heard the muted approach of a stagecoach, as well as another sound, a faint droning. When it was finally revealed under the ghostly light of the moon, the stagecoach appeared to be drawn forward without benefit of horse, or any other visible powers of locomotion, and was almost completely concealed beneath an ample web of dim, translucent silk that waved and flowed like black tresses beneath silent, tranquil waters. Miss Pinefax found that she was strangely transfixed by the odd vehicle, and so denied the urging of her instincts to run. When finally the shrouded coach drew still, the silken veil revealed itself for a thick swarm of filthy flies, which rose up and spread wide across the sky, culminating in the obliteration of the pale lamp of the waxing moon. Enclosed within the living canopy of insect darkness, Miss Pinefax heard the door of the coach open, followed by the sounds of booted footfalls descending a long flight of stairs, longer than what could have been provided by the abrupt length of steps leading down from the coach door. The sound of this descent replaced the soft drone of flies and echoed from within a vast chamber, rather than a spacious apple orchard. The sounds were slowly buried under the weight of a great distance, as the footsteps seemed to travel impossibly deep within the endless dark. The gossamer whispers of the winged darkness returned to steal away the terrified woman's screams, as the sounds she forced from her throat were quickly eaten out of her mouth. Then, solidifying from the soft dissonance of a million fluttering bug wings, raspy words were fashioned. At the last of these spoken words, the darkness dissolved into a carpet of lifeless insects, allowing the night to shine down once again. After the curtain of bug-forged darkness had fallen, Miss Pinefax found herself standing among millions of dead flies in her own apple trees. Granted sight by the restored light of the moon, she could clearly perceive that her orchard had been changed. Her many thousands of apples no longer hung from their branches, but had all been stuffed, along with hay and broken tree branches, into the massive body of a 30-foot-tall scarecrow. The inert creature was held upright by means of a tall wooden post of dark wood, carved from one of those darkly shimmering low-house trees, no doubt, with its outstretched arms secured to apple trees on either side of it, covered in the white frost of the moon's cold light. As to those words spoken to her ancestor by the swarm of night flies, Mrs. Lim would only say,
"I ain't got a mouth that's strong enough, or a tongue brave enough, or even a brain that's smart enough to even try and repeat what my mama on her deathbed told me. You see, it takes a while for you can do it. My mama had that what she told me passed to her by her dying mama. Has been the way of things since the apple man. That what's gotta be said, I can only say to my firstborn daughter. That is, when I'm not long for the world. Good thing, too. Wouldn't want to have to say that and still have any living to do."
Shortly after the invasion of dark shapes that were seen strolling and coach-riding into Devil's Clay, and during a black night of the new moon, sounds could be heard drifting into the air just beyond the Low-House woods. These sounds were, at first, not altogether unusual. The Low-House woods has always been a generous host to strangeness. But later, after the noises had migrated beyond the wood, the sounds became unnatural, as they began to display a nature that held nothing in common with customary reverberations. These sounds were of a large group of beings, loudly, although indistinctly, celebrating some blasphemous event or dark holiday. Buried deep within those audible intimations, there lurked other sounds of fire, the rending and tearing of materials that sounded like fabric, and other wet, flowing sounds that spoke of how the revelers might be celebrating. Additionally, in framing the previous ruckus, there was a grim, bittersweet music. It seemed like an otherworldly orchestra was playing, embellishing a quality to its composition that was unknown to music or sound in general. It sang songs of pure darkness into the deepest spaces of the listener. The song played to an uncertain relationship between sound and soul, serenading the shadows and sins that float like corpses in brackish pools of the spirit, calling out to dead shadows to rise and sing. Before the music of the Dark Festival could shape the conclusion to its strange work, the celebration began moving, and in ways that suggested the existence of spectral pathways that connected the haunted places of the world. Abandoned houses, graveyards, padlocked cellars and attics, even the spider-webbed hollows of ancient dead trees. From these places rose the din of reveling evil things. The celebrants moved with the stolen grace of perdition's angels, roaming from alleyway to cellar, beneath beds and into belfries, and to none of the spaces between them. This vulgar locomotion, combined with a Stygian chorus, served to refresh fears cultivated from whispered stories and dark phantoms after nightfall, and sent the citizens of Greywich fleeing madly from their homes and into hidey-holes. All the townspeople quickly retreated to the thicketed outskirts of the city, filled with nullified confidences and barred doors and guarded thresholds. They stood side by side, in shock, like a great crowd of dead carolers, singing songs of silence and dread, staring blankly into the darkness that had invaded their homes. All the while, unseen devils amused themselves within the forsaken comforts of a stolen city. Only when the sun melted the night into puddles of dappling shadow did the celebration retreat across the Low-House woods and back into the hub of mystery and monsters, leaving only nightmares in its wake. The following day, many prominent Grey Witchers gathered in the well-lit rooms of Mayor Templeton Mum, as it was greatly feared that darkness and secret places were spies for those who dwelt from beyond the Low House woods. The determination of the sunlit congregation was that Devil's Clay should be set ablaze, as once was the intent of Grey Witchers long since past. It was the general opinion of the group that no people dwelt within the wicked place, but rather it was host to something altogether different and unwholesome. Surely, some concern was raised over the planned killing of the only ostensibly human resident, Grey Mathers. However, it was quickly determined that as surely as Devil's Clay was no city, Grey Mathers was no person. And so they would include his ashes within the smoking ruin of his home. The unenviable task of completing this grim mission fell upon the Sheriff of Greywitch, Edward Fleck. The sheriff moved swiftly to complete his task, no doubt to outpace the terror that threatened to paralyze his confidence in ill-conceived missions, and spread his responsibility like a plague, as he quickly conscripted 10 strong Grey Witchers to accompany him with torch and kerosene beyond the shunned bounds of the cursed city. He would also designate another 10 to set fires about the periphery of the Low House Wood, where the trees enclosed the few footpaths that wandered into Devil's Clay. When the men got on past the cusp of the wood, the entire population took one great breath and held it fast. All the while they eyed, long and steady, the distant orange fires that flickered like bug lights in spring. And when those hopeful fires waned to ash and no men returned, every spirit in Greywitch sunk beneath freezing waters of despair. People stood motionless, listening for the inevitable doom that would fill the void that hope had left behind. After a time, a timidly small confidence grew into the minds of the petrified masses. As morning crept closer, they began to hope that the retribution of demons had fallen solely upon the heads of the sheriff and his hapless 20 men. However, when the sun failed to chase the night from the dawn sky of the next day, everyone bowed under a heavy fear, a fear that could not be abated by recourse to the recitation of prayers. While the god of the Grey Witchers had spoken to prophets none had met, and reveled himself through miracles none had witnessed, the devil had chosen to snatch the sun from the sky and pour down an unending ocean of demonic night, drowning the fools who thought their fire could worry the wicked. It was, to some, an omen as certain as death itself. The devil had won his war with God and was seeking the destruction of his enemies' creations. Some villagers slew their children almost immediately and then offered red, wet gifts to the conquering devil of all creation. Several others opened their wrists and throats, or blew out their brains in the desperate hopes of joining their god in glorious retreat across the smoke-dimmed fields of a burning heaven, or perhaps to rest with him in a great cosmic tomb, buried beneath the quiet darkness of cold, dead stars. Nevertheless, when 21 screams exploded over the crooked rooftops, ringing out from the ceaseless depths of the wayward night, the villagers lost sight of wet supplications, and no longer sought out the comforts of death, but merely yearned for the mercy of silence. The screaming men seemed to move quickly across the sky, but it soon became clear that they were not tumbling through it as those who might have been pitched by the devil's hands from the devil's city, but rather like they were being deliberately carried about the high spaces from one house to the next, an abject lesson. The devil's parade of screams continued down those occult byways that abrogated the natural paths reserved for ordinary life, moving into sink drains into the throats of house animals, the inarticulate mouths of infants, without the shifting flames of hearths, and all of the other places where 21 screaming voices should not be heard. When the screams made their final pass through the collective attics and chimney stacks of Greywitch, they sounded as if they were making for the distant reaches of the broken sky, and when finally they could be heard no more, the sun slowly, and with almost fearful deliberation, crept back upon its soaring perch. After, when it seemed as if reason had restored the natural habits of sunlight, sound and shadow, and as curiosity conquered cowardice, doors slowly opened upon the once preternaturally darkened spaces of Grey Witch. Many of them took to the outside, staring at the sun and twirling in its warm rays, hoping to wash the shadows from their bodies. It was at that moment, when bright days denied dark truths, that there occurred a fresh cancellation of normalcy, as 21 pairs of shoes, socks, shirts, and pants, thousands of morning birds, and a legion of insects all came tumbling and burning from somewhere beyond the sunlit sky. Such was the plight of Grey Witch, to live within the twilight of solid truth, where mystery reclaims beliefs once entrusted to certainty, and waking is no solution to dreaming.